the moment Patrick O'Brien saw the woman crumpled beside his well, face down in the dirt with her dark hair spread around her like spilled ink. He knew his quiet life in Caldwell, Kansas, was about to change forever. He dropped the bucket he'd been carrying and ran, his boots kicking up clouds of dust in the late afternoon heat of August 1877. The woman wore a torn calico dress, faded and stained with travel, and her exposed arms were burned red from the sun. Patrick knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers against her neck, relieved to find a pulse beating weakly beneath her skin. "Miss, can you hear me?" He rolled her gently onto her back, and his breath caught. Even in her current state, with her face covered in dust and her lips cracked from dehydration, she was striking. He guessed she was in her early 20s, not much younger than his own 28 years. She didn't respond. Patrick scooped her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, and carried her toward his ranch house. The simple structure wasn't much, just 4 rooms he'd built himself over the past 5 years since claiming this land, but it was clean and it was home. He kicked open the door and brought her to his bedroom, the only place with a proper bed, laying her down on the patchwork quilt his mother had made before she passed. He fetched water and clean cloths, carefully wiping the dirt from her face and moistening her lips. She stirred slightly, a small moan escaping her throat. Patrick continued his ministrations, cleaning her arms and checking for injuries. Aside from the sunburn and obvious dehydration, he found bruising on her wrists and ankles like she'd been bound. His jaw tightened. He'd seen enough trouble come through Caldwell to recognize the signs. The town sat along the Kishom Trail, and while it brought prosperity, it also brought men who preyed on the vulnerable. "Come on now," he murmured, lifting her head and pressing a cup of water to her lips. "Just a little. You need this." Some instinct made her swallow, and he gave her small sips, knowing too much too fast would make her sick. After several minutes, her eyelids fluttered. Patrick found himself holding his breath as her eyes opened, revealing irises the color of spring grass, bright and startling against her dirt-smudged face. She stared at him in confusion, then panic, trying to push herself up. "Where am I? Who are you? Easy now." Patrick held up his hands, backing away to give her space. "You're safe. I'm Patrick O'Brien. This is my ranch about 3 miles outside Caldwell. I found you collapsed by my well." Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the simple furniture, the rifle mounted on the wall, the window showing the golden prairie stretching to the horizon. Some of the panic faded, replaced by exhaustion. She slumped back against the pillow. "How long have I been here?" "About 20 minutes. You were unconscious when I found you. What's your name, miss?" She hesitated, studying his face as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. Patrick kept his expression open, patient. He'd been told he had an honest face, all hard angles and sun-weathered skin, with his father's blue eyes that people said looked kind. "Grace," she finally said. "Grace Gardner." "Well, Miss Gardner, you look like you've been through hell. Can you tell me what happened?" Grace closed her eyes, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I was with a wagon train heading to California. We were camped about a day's ride from here when we were attacked. Bandits. They took everything, killed the men who fought back, and—" She stopped, shaking her head. "Some of us, the younger women they took us, said they'd sell us in one of the border towns." Patrick felt anger burn hot in his chest. He'd heard stories of such men, human vultures who preyed on settlers, but hearing it from someone who'd lived through it made his blood boil. "I managed to escape last night," Grace continued, her voice stronger now. "We'd camped not far from here. One of them got careless with the ropes and I slipped free. I ran. I just kept running. By the time the sun came up, I didn't know where I was, but I kept going. I saw your well and thought maybe I could get water, but—" She gestured weakly at herself. "I guess I didn't make it that far." "You made it far enough," Patrick said firmly. "You're alive and you're safe now. Did you see which direction they went? North, I think. But please—" She reached out, her hand catching his sleeve. "Don't go after them. There were at least 8 of them, maybe more. They're dangerous men." "I'm not fool enough to take on a gang alone," Patrick assured her. "But I'll ride into town tomorrow, tell the marshal. He can organize a posse." Grace nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Thank you for helping me, for not—" She trailed off, but Patrick understood what she meant. "You don't need to thank me for being decent," he said quietly. "Now you need to rest. When did you last eat? I don't remember. Before the attack, maybe. I'll fix you something. Nothing heavy, just some broth and bread. Think you can manage that? I'll try." Patrick left her in the bedroom and went to his kitchen, such as it was. He had a pot of beef broth he'd made 2 days ago, still good in the cool cellar. He heated it on his cast iron stove and cut thick slices from a loaf of bread he'd bought in town. Simple fare, but nourishing. When he returned, Grace was sitting up, looking stronger already. She drank the broth slowly, and by the end of the bowl, color had returned to her cheeks. "That's the best thing I've ever tasted," she said, managing a small smile. It transformed her face, and Patrick felt something shift in his chest. He told himself it was just sympathy, natural compassion for someone who'd been through trauma. But when she smiled at him like that, he couldn't help but notice the delicate curve of her jaw, the way her eyes lit up. "It's nothing fancy," he said, busying himself with taking the bowl, "but there's more if you want it later. For now, you should sleep. Real sleep. What about you? This is your bed. I can't take your room. I've got blankets and a perfectly good floor in the main room. Done it plenty of times." "You need proper rest to heal." Grace looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won. "Just for tonight. Tomorrow I'll figure out what to do next." Patrick nodded and left her, closing the door softly behind him. He stood in his main room, looking around at the life he'd built. 5 years of hard work, of turning raw prairie into a working cattle ranch. It was lonely sometimes, sure, but it was his. Predictable. Safe. He had a feeling that as of today, predictable was out the window. That night, Patrick lay awake on his bedroll, listening to the sounds of the prairie through his open window. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to each other. His cattle shifted and lowed in their pen, and in his bedroom, Grace Gardner slept. He thought about her story, about the brutality men were capable of. He'd seen his share of violence since coming to Kansas. The territory was still rough, still finding its way between lawlessness and civilization. Caldwell itself had only been incorporated a few years back, and the cattle drives brought both prosperity and trouble. But underneath his anger at what had been done to Grace, Patrick felt something else. A protectiveness that went beyond simple human decency. He barely knew this woman, yet the thought of anyone hurting her made him want to do violence himself. He finally drifted off sometime near dawn, and when he woke, the sun was already climbing the sky. He sat up, disoriented by sleeping late, and immediately looked toward his bedroom door. Still closed. Patrick went outside to tend to his animals first. He had 20 head of cattle, a few horses, and some chickens that provided eggs. It wasn't a large operation, but it was growing. He milked his cow, gathered eggs, and checked the fence line nearest the house. All the while, his mind kept drifting back to Grace. When he returned to the house, carrying a pail of fresh milk and a basket of eggs, he found her in the kitchen. She'd changed out of her torn dress into one of his shirts, which hung to her knees like a nightgown. Her hair was damp, and he realized she must have washed using the basin. "Morning," he said, setting down his burdens. "You're looking better. I feel better. I hope you don't mind. I used some water to clean up. That's what it's there for. Are you hungry? Starving? Patrick cooked eggs and bacon, fried up some cornbread, and they ate together at his small wooden table. Grace devoured her food with an appetite that pleased him. She needed to build her strength back. I should go into town today, Patrick said as they finished eating. Talk to the marshal, like I said. Do you feel up to coming along? He'll want to hear your story directly. Grace hesitated, her hand tightening around her coffee cup. I suppose I should. The other women, if there's any chance of helping them. Exactly. And we need to get you some proper clothes. Maybe find out if anyone from your wagon train made it to town. I don't have any money. The bandits took everything. Don't worry about that right now. We'll figure it out. An hour later, they were riding toward Caldwell. Patrick had given Grace one of his horses, an even-tempered mare named Daisy. Grace sat the horse well, despite her ordeal, and Patrick found himself curious about her background. You ride like you've done it before, he commented. My father had a farm in Missouri. I grew up on horseback. Her voice went soft. He died 2 years ago, cholera. After that, there wasn't much keeping me there. When I heard about the opportunities out west, about land and new beginnings, it seemed like fate. I'm sorry about your father. Thank you. What about you? What brought you to Kansas? Patrick gazed out at the rolling prairie, the grass rippling like water in the wind. Similar story, I suppose. My parents had a small farm in Ohio. When they passed, my brother got the land, being the eldest. I didn't begrudge him that, but I wanted something of my own. Heard about the Homestead Act, about free land if you were willing to work it. Came out here in '72, staked my claim, and haven't looked back. Do you miss it, Ohio? Sometimes. Miss my family. But I've got 3 brothers and 2 sisters, all scattered now. We write when we can. This is home now. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and Patrick found himself acutely aware of Grace's presence beside him. The way she sat straight in the saddle despite her exhaustion. The way the wind caught strands of her dark hair, making them dance. He forced himself to focus on the trail ahead. Caldwell appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along the trail. It was growing fast, sprouting new structures every few months. There was a main street with a general store, a hotel, 3 saloons, a church, and the marshal's office. Side streets were filling in with houses and businesses. They tied their horses outside the marshal's office, and Patrick led Grace inside. Marshal Tom Cooper was at his desk, a grizzled man in his 50s with a thick mustache and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Patrick, he greeted, standing up. Then his gaze shifted to Grace, taking in her appearance in Patrick's oversized shirt and borrowed pants. What's this about? Marshal Cooper, this is Miss Grace Gardner. I found her collapsed on my property yesterday. She's got a story you need to hear. For the next 30 minutes, Grace recounted her ordeal. Patrick watched the marshal's face darken as she described the attack, the kidnapping, her escape. When she finished, Cooper sat back in his chair, shaking his head. Sounds like the Dalton gang. They've been working this area for months. We've had reports, but they're slippery as snakes. He looked at Grace with something like admiration. You're lucky to be alive, miss. And brave as hell to escape like that. The other women, Grace said urgently. Is there anything we can do? I'll send telegrams to the surrounding towns, get descriptions out. Put together a posse and see if we can pick up their trail. But I'll be honest with you, if they've got a day's head start, chances are slim. He stood. I'll do everything I can. In the meantime, where are you staying? Grace looked at Patrick uncertainly. He spoke before he could second-guess himself. She's staying at my ranch for now. Until she figures out her next move. Cooper's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. Good. She'll need a safe place. Miss Gardner, I'll let you know if we find anything. They left the office and Patrick guided Grace down the street to the general store. Inside, amid the barrels of flour and sugar, the hanging tools and tin goods, there was a small section of women's clothing. "Pick out what you need," Patrick said. "A couple dresses, undergarments, shoes if yours don't fit right. Whatever you need." "Patrick, I can't let you do this. You've already done so much. You can pay me back when you're able. Consider it a loan." Grace looked like she wanted to argue further, but the shop owner, Mrs. Patterson, bustled over with a warm smile. "Can I help you folks?" Patrick excused himself, letting the women handle the clothing selection. He busied himself buying supplies he needed anyway, flour and coffee and ammunition for his rifle. But he couldn't help glancing over occasionally, watching Grace hold up a simple blue dress, seeing Mrs. Patterson nod approvingly. He was in trouble, Patrick realized. Deep trouble. He'd known this woman for less than a day, and already she was occupying far too much of his thoughts. They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon heat, Grace now wearing her new blue dress and looking more like herself. She sat taller in the saddle, and there was color in her cheeks. Patrick carried the rest of her purchases in a bag tied to his saddle. "Thank you," Grace said as the ranch came into view. "For everything. The clothes, talking to the marshal, giving me a place to stay." "I know I keep saying it, but I mean it. You didn't have to do any of this. Maybe not. But it's the right thing to do. Besides," he added, trying to lighten the mood, "I could use the company. Gets lonely out here talking to cows all day." That earned him a real laugh, and the sound of it did something to Patrick's heart. Over the next few days, they fell into an unexpected routine. Patrick went about his ranch work, and Grace helped where she could. She insisted on earning her keep, cooking meals and tending the garden patch behind the house. She gathered eggs, helped him repair a section of fence, and proved herself capable with horses when one of his mares needed attention. They talked while they worked, sharing stories of their pasts. Patrick learned that Grace had been a schoolteacher back in Missouri, that she loved reading, and had brought 3 books with her on the wagon train, all lost now. He told her about building his house, about his first winter when he'd nearly frozen, about the satisfaction of seeing his first calf born on his land. At night, they sat outside and watched the stars, the prairie spreading dark and vast around them. Patrick pointed out constellations while Grace told him the myths behind them. "You know a lot about the stars," Patrick observed one evening about a week after he'd found her. "My father taught me. He said knowing the stars meant you'd never truly be lost." Smart man. He was. Grace was quiet for a moment. "Patrick, I've been thinking. I need to find work, start saving money. I can't stay here indefinitely living off your charity." Patrick had been dreading this conversation. "You're not a charity case. You help plenty around here. You know what I mean. I need to support myself properly. Maybe I could get a job in town, see if the school needs a teacher." School doesn't start until September, and they hired their teacher back in June. "But," he said slowly, an idea forming, "what if you stayed on here, as a hired hand, proper wages and all? Lord knows I could use the help, and you've proven yourself more than capable." Grace turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the starlight. "You do that, if you're willing. It's honest work and honest pay. You'd have your own space," he added quickly. "I could partition off part of the barn loft, make it comfortable. Wouldn't be anything improper." "I'm not worried about impropriety. You've been nothing but a gentleman," she smiled. "All right, I accept, but I want a fair wage, not charity dressed up as employment. Deal?" They shook on it, and Patrick tried to ignore how right her hand felt in his. True to his word, Patrick spent the next few days converting part of the barn loft into living quarters for Grace. He built a sturdy wall for privacy, installed a small window, and brought up a bed frame and mattress he bought in town. Grace helped, insisting on doing her share of the hammering and carrying. "This is nicer than some places I've lived," she said, looking around the finished space. "Thank you, Patrick. You keep thanking me, going to wear the words out. Then I'll have to find new ways to show my gratitude." She said it innocently, but something in her tone made Patrick's pulse quicken. He cleared his throat. "Well, I should let you get settled. Big day tomorrow, teaching you the rest of the ranch work." August faded into September, and the brutal heat gave way to slightly cooler days. Patrick taught Grace everything about running the ranch. She learned to rope cattle, to check for disease, to read the signs of weather in the sky. She was a quick study, picking up in weeks what had taken him months to learn. They worked side by side from dawn to dusk, and Patrick couldn't remember a time when he'd been happier. Grace's laughter became a regular sound on his ranch, and her presence made everything brighter somehow. The work didn't seem as hard, the meals tasted better. Even the cattle seemed more content. He was falling for her. Patrick knew it, had known it for weeks probably, but he didn't know what to do about it. Grace was his employee now. She depended on him for her livelihood. What if he said something and made her uncomfortable? What if she didn't feel the same way and felt obligated to leave? But sometimes he caught her looking at him with an expression that made his breath catch. Sometimes their hands would brush while working, and she wouldn't pull away immediately. Sometimes, when they sat together in the evenings talking about everything and nothing, the space between them seemed charged with possibility. One cool September evening, a storm rolled in across the prairie. Patrick and Grace rushed to get the animals secured, working in the rising wind. By the time they finished, the first fat raindrops were falling. They ran for the house, laughing, but got drenched anyway. Inside, they stood dripping on the floor, breathing hard, grinning at each other like fools. "I'll get towels," Patrick said, but Grace caught his arm. "Wait." He turned back, and suddenly she was very close. Her wet hair clung to her face and neck. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her curves. But it was her eyes that held him, green and intense and full of something that made his heart race. "Patrick," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. You saved my life, gave me a home, treated me with respect and kindness. But that's not why I'm staying." She took a breath. "I'm staying because somewhere along the way I fell in love with you." Patrick's world tilted. "Grace, you don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. If you don't feel the same way, we can pretend I never said it. I'll still work hard, I won't make things awkward. He kissed her, pulled her close and pressed his lips to hers, cutting off her rambling words. She made a small sound of surprise, then melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck. The kiss was everything Patrick had imagined and more. Grace tasted like rain and something sweet, uniquely her. Her lips were soft, responsive, and when she sighed against his mouth, he felt it in his bones. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Patrick rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said roughly. "Been trying not to, telling myself it was too fast, too complicated. But Grace, I love you. Think I started falling that first day when you opened your eyes and looked at me. Really, really." She laughed, the sound full of joy and relief, and kissed him again. They stood there in his entryway, soaking wet and completely lost in each other, while the storm raged outside. Later, they sat together on his small sofa, wrapped in blankets, watching lightning flash through the windows. Grace was tucked against Patrick's side, her head on his shoulder, and he couldn't stop touching her. Her hair, her arm, her hand, making sure she was real. "What happens now?" Grace asked softly. "Well, I'd like to court you properly. Do this right. Then, if you'll have me, I'd like to marry you." Grace lifted her head to look at him. "Patrick O'Brien, are you proposing?" "Not yet. When I propose, you'll know it. I'll do it right with a ring and everything. But I'm telling you my intentions. Want you to know I'm serious about this, about us. I'm serious too." She settled back against him. "Though I should warn you, I'm terrible at sewing and I burn biscuits more often than not. I've eaten your cooking for weeks now. Haven't died yet." She swatted his arm playfully and he caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. They sat there until the storm passed, talking about the future, about dreams and plans. Patrick told her about wanting to expand his ranch, maybe start breeding horses in addition to cattle. Grace talked about maybe starting a small school for ranch children in the area, teaching in the winters when ranch work slowed down. It all felt possible suddenly. A future he'd barely let himself imagine was spreading out before him, bright and full of promise. The next morning dawned clear and washed clean by the rain. Patrick woke on the sofa where he'd fallen asleep with Grace in his arms. She was still there, awake now, watching him with a soft smile. "Morning," she whispered. "Morning." He kissed her forehead. "This is a sight I could get used to." "Me too." They reluctantly disentangled themselves and went about starting the day, but everything felt different now. When Patrick helped Grace down from the barn loft where she'd gone to change, his hands lingered on her waist. When Grace poured his coffee, her fingers brushed his deliberately. They were courting now, and the air between them practically crackled with new energy. Marshal Cooper rode out to the ranch 2 days later with news. They'd tracked the Dalton gang to a camp near the Oklahoma border. There had been a shootout. Several gang members were dead, others arrested. Most importantly, they'd freed 5 women who'd been held captive. "Did any of them know about Miss Gardner's escape?" Patrick asked. "They did. Said you're something of a legend among them, Miss Gardner. The one who got away, gave the others hope." Cooper tipped his hat to Grace. "Thought you'd want to know they're safe now. Being cared for in town until we can contact their families or figure out their situations." After the marshal left, Grace was quiet. Patrick found her in the garden staring at nothing. "You all right?" he asked gently. "I'm fine. Just thinking about how things could have gone differently. If I hadn't escaped, if you hadn't found me." She shuddered. Patrick pulled her close. "But you did escape and I did find you. You're safe now. We both are, I know. Sometimes it just hits me how lucky I am. Not luck. You're strong, Grace. Brave. You saved yourself. I just helped with the last bit." She turned in his arms, looking up at him. "We saved each other, I think." He kissed her soft and slow there in the garden with the late summer sun warming them. She was right. They had saved each other. October brought cooler weather and preparations for winter. Patrick and Grace worked together to ensure the ranch was ready. They reinforced the barn, stocked up on feed, salted meat, and canned vegetables from the garden. They worked as a seamless team now, anticipating each other's needs, moving in harmony. On the first day of October, Patrick rode into Caldwell alone. He had a specific errand, one he wanted to keep secret. At the general store, he spoke with Mr. Patterson in low tones. "I need a ring. Something special, but I don't have a lot of money." Mr. Patterson smiled knowingly. "For Miss Gardner, I take it. Wondered when you'd be coming in." He pulled out a small box from under the counter. Inside was a simple gold band with a small sapphire. "Had this in the family for years. Was my grandmother's. Never had a daughter to pass it to, and my wife says it should go to someone who'll appreciate it. Stone's the color of sky over the prairie, we always thought. Seems fitting." Patrick swallowed hard. "How much?" "What you can afford. I know you're good for it." They settled on a price that was more than fair, and Patrick left with the ring burning a hole in his pocket. He just needed to find the right moment. That moment came a week later. Patrick had asked Grace to ride out with him to check on the cattle in the far pasture. It was a beautiful October day, the sky impossibly blue, the air crisp and clean. The prairie grass had turned gold and it rippled in the breeze like an ocean. They rode to the top of a rise where you could see for miles. Patrick's land spread out below them, everything he'd worked for. But none of it meant as much as the woman beside him. "Grace," he said, dismounting. "Come here." She slid from her horse, curious. "What is it?" Patrick took her hands in his. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "3 months ago, I was a lonely man with a quiet life. Then you appeared and everything changed. You've made my house feel like a home. You've made me laugh more in these months than I have in years. You've made me want things I'd stopped letting myself want." "Patrick." Grace's eyes were already shining with tears. He dropped to one knee, pulling out the ring. "I know it hasn't been long, but when you know, you know. Grace Gardner, I love you with everything I am. Will you marry me? Will you stay here and build a life with me?" "Yes." The word came out on a sob of joy. "Yes, absolutely yes." Patrick slid the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. It fit perfectly, the sapphire catching the light. Then he was standing and Grace was in his arms, kissing him with everything she had. "I love you," she said between kisses. "I love you so much." They stood there on that hill, holding each other while their horses grazed peacefully nearby. Patrick had never imagined feeling this happy, this complete. Grace was laughing and crying at the same time, looking at her ring, then at him, then at the ring again. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Patrick, it's perfect. Like you." They rode back to the ranch in a state of euphoria, already making plans. They decided on a November wedding, simple but meaningful. Grace wanted to be married in the little church in Caldwell, with anyone who wanted to attend welcome to come. The next few weeks were a flurry of preparation. Grace made her own wedding dress with help from Mrs. Patterson and other women from town who'd befriended her during her visits. Patrick cleaned up the ranch house, built proper furniture for the bedroom they'd share, and even painted the exterior. Marshall Cooper agreed to stand up with Patrick, and Mrs. Patterson would stand with Grace. The whole town seemed excited about the wedding. It wasn't often they got to celebrate something joyful, and people were ready for a party. The night before the wedding, Patrick and Grace sat outside together one last time as an unmarried couple. The November air was cold and they sat close together under a blanket. "Nervous?" Patrick asked. "Not even a little." Grace smiled at him. "You?" "Same, just excited." "I never thought I'd be grateful for what happened to me," Grace said slowly. "The attack, the kidnapping, all of it was horrible, but if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have ended up here, wouldn't have found you." "I know what you mean. Sometimes the worst things lead to the best things." "Patrick, I need you to know something. Tomorrow, when I say my vows, I mean every word. I choose you. I choose this life. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because there's nowhere else I want to be." He kissed her, pouring everything he felt into it. "I choose you too, Grace. Every day for the rest of my life, I'll keep choosing you." The wedding day dawned cold but clear. Patrick dressed in his best suit, bought new for the occasion, and rode into town early. The church was small, but someone had decorated it with late-season wildflowers. Chairs were filled with townspeople, ranch families from the area, anyone who wanted to witness the union. Patrick stood at the altar with Marshall Cooper beside him, trying not to fidget with his collar. The pianist began to play, and everyone stood. Then Grace appeared in the doorway, and Patrick forgot how to breathe. She wore a simple white dress, but to Patrick, she looked like an angel. Her dark hair was pinned up with small flowers woven through it. She carried a bouquet of prairie flowers, and she was smiling at him like he was the only person in the world. Mrs. Patterson walked with her down the aisle, giving her away in the absence of family. When Grace reached Patrick, she took his hands, and he felt the slight tremble in hers. "You're beautiful," he whispered. "You're not so bad yourself," she whispered back, eyes sparkling. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They spoke traditional vows, promising to love and honor each other through whatever came. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Patrick kissed Grace thoroughly, to the cheering approval of everyone present. The reception was held at the town hall, with food brought by everyone in attendance. There was music and dancing, and Patrick discovered Grace was an excellent dancer. They waltzed together while people clapped and whistled. "Happy?" he asked, holding her close. "Happier than I've ever been." As the sun set, they said their goodbyes and rode back to the ranch together. Patrick lifted Grace down from her horse and, without a word, scooped her up in his arms and carried her through the door of their home. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, everything Patrick had hoped it would be. Grace was his wife now, and the reality of it filled him with awe. They loved each other slowly, carefully, learning each other's bodies and responses. Afterward, they lay tangled together, talking softly until sleep claimed them both. The winter that followed was harsh, with snow that piled up past the windows and wind that howled around the house. But inside, Patrick and Grace were warm and content. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other, playing cards, making love. Patrick taught Grace to play chess, and she became good enough to beat him regularly. The isolation that had once bothered Patrick was now a gift. He had Grace all to himself, and they took full advantage of the forced closeness. They talked about everything, sharing their deepest thoughts and fears and dreams. Patrick learned that Grace wanted children, at least 3. Grace learned that Patrick secretly wrote poetry, though he was too embarrassed to show anyone. "Read me one," she demanded one snowy evening. "They're not good." "I don't care. Read me one." Reluctantly, Patrick pulled out a worn notebook and read her a poem he'd written about the prairie. Grace listened with her eyes closed, and when he finished, she was crying. "That was beautiful," she said fiercely. "Don't you dare say it's not good." He kissed her, grateful for her support, for believing in him even in small things like this. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts. By April, the prairie was green again, wildflowers blooming in profusion. Patrick and Grace worked together to prepare for the busy season ahead. They had new calves to care for, fences to repair, and crops to plant in the expanded garden. One morning in May, Grace came to Patrick in the barn where he was working. Something in her expression made him set down his tools immediately. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." She took his hands, placing them on her still, flat stomach. "Patrick, I'm pregnant." Joy exploded through him. "Really? You're sure?" "I'm sure. Mrs. Patterson confirmed it yesterday when I rode into town. We're going to have a baby." Patrick whooped and spun her around, then immediately set her down carefully. "Sorry, should I not have done that?" "Did I hurt you?" Grace laughed. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass, but yes, you need to be excited. We're having a baby." They held each other, laughing and crying at the same time. A baby. Patrick was going to be a father. The enormity of it was overwhelming, but looking at Grace's radiant face, he felt ready for it. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Grace bloomed, growing rounder as summer advanced. Patrick was endlessly fascinated by the changes in her body, the way her belly swelled with their child. He talked to the baby, pressing his ear to Grace's stomach to listen for movement. They prepared the small extra room in the house as a nursery. Patrick built a cradle with his own hands, carving small designs into the wood. Grace sewed tiny clothes and blankets. They were as ready as first-time parents could be. Grace went into labor on a cold January morning, almost exactly 1 year after their wedding. Patrick rode like the wind to fetch Mrs. Patterson, who served as the town midwife. The hours that followed were the longest of Patrick's life. He paced outside the bedroom door, listening to Grace's labored breathing and occasional cries of pain. He felt helpless, unable to do anything but wait and pray. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a new sound filled the house. The strong, healthy cry of a newborn baby. Mrs. Patterson opened the door, smiling. "Come meet your son, Patrick." Patrick's legs felt weak as he entered the bedroom. Grace was propped up against the pillows, exhausted but glowing. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a blanket. His son. "Patrick, come here," Grace said softly. He approached on shaking legs, looking down at the tiny red face peeking from the blanket. His son had a shock of dark hair like his mother and was crying lustily, tiny fists waving. "He's perfect," Patrick whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Grace, he's perfect. Want to hold him?" Patrick took the baby with extreme care, supporting the small head like Mrs. Patterson showed him. His son quieted, seeming to study Patrick's face with unfocused eyes. "Hello there," Patrick said softly. "I'm your father. Welcome to the world, little one." "We need to name him," Grace said. They discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Patrick knew. "What about James? After your father?" Grace's eyes filled with fresh tears. "You do that, of course. James Patrick O'Brien, what do you think?" "I think it's perfect." James was an easy baby, relatively speaking. He ate well and slept in predictable patterns. Patrick took to fatherhood like he'd been born for it, changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor with James when he was fussy. Grace watched her husband with their son and fell even more in love with him, if that was possible. The months passed in a blur of sleepless nights and baby milestones. James smiled, then laughed, then began trying to crawl. Patrick's ranch continued to prosper. He hired a young man named David to help with the work, giving Patrick more time to spend with his family. When James was 6 months old, Grace came to Patrick with a familiar expression. "I have news." Patrick's eyes widened. "Already?" "Already. Apparently, the O'Brien men are very persuasive." They laughed together and Patrick pulled her close, mindful of James sleeping in his cradle nearby. "Another baby. Are you happy about it?" "Thrilled, are you?" "Couldn't be happier." Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Grace O'Brien, was born the following spring. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's dark hair, and Patrick fell in love all over again. James, now over a year old, was fascinated by his baby sister. Life settled into a chaotic but joyful rhythm. Patrick's ranch continued to grow, becoming one of the most successful in the area. He added horses to his operation, breeding and training them for sale. The money was good, allowing him to build an addition onto the house, giving the children their own rooms. Grace started her school, just as she dreamed. In the winters, children from surrounding ranches would come to their home 3 days a week for lessons. Patrick built a small schoolhouse on their property, and Grace taught reading, writing, and arithmetic with patience and enthusiasm. Years passed, each one bringing new challenges and joys. James grew into a serious boy who loved working with the horses. Sarah was spirited and adventurous, always getting into mischief. When Sarah was 3, Grace gave birth to twins, a boy and girl they named Thomas and Emma. The house that had once seemed too large for one lonely bachelor was now filled with noise and laughter and life. Patrick couldn't walk through a room without stepping on a toy or being ambushed by a small child wanting attention. It was chaotic and exhausting and absolutely perfect. One summer evening when James was 8, Sarah 6, and the twins 3, Patrick and Grace sat on their porch watching the children play in the yard. James was teaching Sarah to rope a fence post while the twins chased chickens, giggling madly. "Can you believe this is our life?" Grace asked, leaning against Patrick's shoulder. Sometimes I have to pinch myself. Remember when I was alone out here thinking I'd probably die a bachelor? Remember when I was running for my life, thinking I'd never be safe again? Patrick pulled her closer. We've come a long way. We have. And Patrick, I'm pregnant again. He started to laugh, deep and genuine. You're serious, completely serious. Due in February, I think. 5 children. We're going to have 5 children. Are you upset? Patrick looked at his wife, at the woman who'd changed his entire world, who'd given him more happiness than he'd ever dreamed possible. Upset? Grace, I'm honored. Every child we have is a blessing. Even when they're all crying at once and the house is a disaster and we haven't slept in days. Even then. Their 5th child, a boy they named Henry, was born during a February snowstorm. He was their easiest baby, content and calm from the start. James and Sarah doted on him, and the twins were fascinated by their new baby brother. Patrick, now in his late 30s, sometimes looked at his life in wonder. His ranch was prosperous, known throughout Kansas for quality horses and cattle. His children were healthy and happy. His wife was his best friend and the love of his life. He'd built something lasting and good. Grace, for her part, had found the new beginning she'd sought all those years ago. Her school had grown to include a dozen children from the area. She was respected in the community, known for her kindness and intelligence. And she had a family she adored, a husband who loved her without reservation. One autumn day, when Henry was 6 months old and the older children were all at various activities, Patrick and Grace rode out to the hill where he'd proposed. It had become a tradition for them. Escaping occasionally for a few hours alone, they stood together, looking out over the land. The ranch had tripled in size over the years. Patrick's original small house was now a spacious home. The barn had been rebuilt twice to accommodate their growing operation. Fields of crops surrounded the buildings, and cattle dotted the pastures. You ever think about that day I found you? Patrick asked. All the time. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago at the same time. Grace turned to look at him. Do you ever regret it? Taking me in, falling in love so fast, all of it? Not for 1 second. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace. You and our children, this life we've built. It's more than I ever hoped for. I love you, Patrick O'Brien. More now than even the day I married you. I love you too. Always have, always will. They kissed, these two people who'd found each other against all odds, a lonely rancher and a desperate woman who'd collapsed by his well. What had started as a simple act of kindness had grown into something beautiful and lasting. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and orange, they rode home together. They could hear their children's laughter before they even reached the house. James was chasing Sarah through the yard while the twins toddled after them. Inside, Henry would be sleeping peacefully in his cradle. Patrick helped Grace dismount, his hands lingering on her waist. She smiled at him, that same smile that had captivated him from the first day, and he knew he'd keep falling in love with her every day for the rest of his life. They walked toward their home together, hand in hand, ready for whatever came next. They'd weathered storms and hardship, had celebrated triumphs and weathered disappointments. But through it all, they'd had each other. Years continued to pass in a blur of activity. James grew tall and strong, taking over more ranch responsibilities. At 18, he announced his intention to start his own spread on land adjacent to Patrick's. Patrick was proud, helping his son get established, passing on everything he'd learned. Sarah, at 16, was courting the son of a neighboring rancher. Grace watched with mixed feelings as her daughter grew into a young woman. The twins, now 13, were inseparable, Thomas quiet and studious like his older brother, Emma bold and adventurous like Sarah. Henry, the baby, was now 10 and showing a talent for working with horses that exceeded even his father's. Patrick spent hours with him in the corral, teaching him to train the animals with patience and respect. Patrick and Grace were in their late 40s now, with threads of silver in their hair and lines on their faces earned through years of laughter and hard work. But they were healthy and happy, surrounded by the family they'd created. One evening, after a long day during which they'd hosted James and his new bride for dinner along with Sarah and her young man, Patrick and Grace finally had a moment alone. They sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. "Our babies are all grown up," Grace said softly. "Not all of them. We've still got the twins and Henry. You know what I mean, soon it'll be just us again, like when we started." Patrick pulled her close. "Is that such a bad thing?" "No, I think I might like having you to myself again." She looked up at him. "We've had a good life, haven't we? The best." "Grace, marrying you was the smartest thing I ever did. Finding you was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me." "Not luck, fate," Grace laughed. "You're a romantic Patrick O'Brien, only for you." They sat together in comfortable silence, these two people who'd built a life from nothing. Patrick thought back to that day, almost 20 years ago, when he'd seen a woman collapsed by his well. He'd had no idea how completely she'd change his world. Grace was thinking similar thoughts. She remembered running through the darkness, desperate and afraid, certain she'd die on the prairie. Instead, she'd found safety, love, and a home. She'd found Patrick. Time continued its steady march. Sarah married her sweetheart in a beautiful ceremony at the same church where Patrick and Grace had wed. The twins went off to different paths, Thomas to study law in Kansas City, Emma staying to help run the ranch, and eventually marrying a kind veterinarian who settled in Caldwell. Henry, true to form, stayed close to home, building a reputation as one of the best horse trainers in Kansas. He never married, content with his animals and his work, living in a cabin on the ranch property. Patrick and Grace grew older gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents. Their home was always full of family, especially on holidays when everyone gathered. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Patrick took Grace back to the well where he'd found her. They were both slower now, with aches and pains that came with age, but they made the walk together. 40 years, Patrick said, looking at the well that still stood, though they'd rebuilt it twice over the decades. "Can you believe it? Some days it feels like 40 minutes. Other days like 400 years, Grace smiled. "But every day I've been grateful, same here. Grace, I want you to know something. If I could go back and live my life over, I wouldn't change a single thing. Every moment, good and bad, led me to you, led us to this." Tears streamed down Grace's weathered face. "Oh, Patrick, I feel the same way. I'd walk through fire if I knew you'd be at the end of it." They held each other by that old well, two people who'd been through so much together. They'd built a ranch, raised 5 children, weathered droughts and storms and economic hardship. They'd buried friends and celebrated births. They'd lived a full, rich life together. As the sun set on their 40th anniversary, Patrick and Grace walked home hand in hand, just as they'd done countless times before. Their house, expanded and modified over the years, glowed with lamplight. They could see Henry moving around in the barn, tending to his horses. That night, lying in bed together, Grace's head on Patrick's shoulder as it had been for 4 decades, they talked about their life. "You have any regrets?" Patrick asked. "Not a single one. You, only that we can't live it all over again." Grace lifted her head to look at him. Even in the darkness, she could make out the beloved features of his face. "We don't need to. We lived it right the first time." Patrick kissed her soft and sweet. "I love you, Grace O'Brien." "I love you too, Patrick, always and forever." They drifted off to sleep together, secure in their love and the life they'd built. Outside, the Kansas wind whispered through the prairie grass. The cattle settled for the night. The horses shifted in their stalls. And the ranch that had started with one lonely man and one desperate woman continued to thrive, a testament to what could grow from a simple act of kindness, and two hearts willing to take a chance on love. The years that followed were peaceful ones. Patrick and Grace spent their days enjoying their family, tending to the ranch at a slower pace and simply being together. They took walks every evening, weather permitting, talking about everything and nothing. After so many years, they could communicate with just a look, finishing each other's sentences without thinking. When Patrick turned 65, he officially turned the ranch over to James and Henry to run together. It was time, he decided, to enjoy his remaining years without the daily grind of ranch work. Grace agreed wholeheartedly. They'd both worked hard enough for multiple lifetimes. They traveled a little, taking the train to visit Thomas in Kansas City and seeing Emma and her family in their home near Caldwell. They visited Sarah at her ranch, playing with grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But they always came home to their own place, the land that had been the foundation of their life together. On a warm spring day, when Patrick was 70 and Grace 68, they sat together on their porch watching a storm roll in across the prairie. It reminded them of that first storm the night they'd confessed their love. "I've been thinking," Grace said quietly, "about that day you found me, about how different my life would have been if I'd collapsed anywhere else, if anyone else had found me, or if no one had." "Don't think about that," Patrick said firmly, squeezing her hand. "You were meant to be here with me." "I know. I just want to make sure you know how grateful I am, not just for saving me that day, but for every day since, for loving me the way you have, for building this life with me." Patrick turned to look at his wife. She was still beautiful to him, even with her hair gone completely silver and her face lined with wrinkles. She was the same woman he'd fallen in love with, her green eyes still bright and full of life. "Grace, you saved me just as much as I saved you. I was existing, not living. You taught me what it meant to really live, to love and be loved, to have purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me everything." They kissed, these two people who'd spent a lifetime together, and it was as sweet as their first kiss. The storm broke overhead, rain drumming on the roof, thunder rolling across the prairie. But Patrick and Grace were safe and warm, together as they'd been for nearly 50 years. They stayed on the porch, watching nature's display, holding hands and content in their shared silence. That night, lying in bed, Patrick held Grace close. "Promise me something," he said softly, "anything. Whatever happens, wherever we end up after this life, we'll find each other again." "Patrick, that's not even a question. Of course we will. We're meant to be together. This life, next life, whatever comes, you're stuck with me forever." He chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest where Grace's head rested. "Good. That's exactly how I want it." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, secure in a love that had withstood the test of time and would continue beyond it. Patrick O'Brien passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years later, at the age of 73. He simply didn't wake up one morning, having died with a smile on his face and his wife beside him. The doctor said it was his heart, just worn out after a long, full life. Grace was devastated but not broken. They'd had 53 beautiful years together, and she was grateful for every single day. She stayed in their home, surrounded by family who made sure she was never alone for long. She lived for another 5 years, long enough to see 2 more great-grandchildren born, long enough to celebrate her granddaughter's wedding. On a quiet autumn evening, sitting in her chair on the porch where she and Patrick had spent countless hours, Grace closed her eyes and didn't open them again. The family buried her beside Patrick in the cemetery in Caldwell, under a large oak tree. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names, dates, and a single line Grace had requested: 2 souls, 1 heart forever. The ranch continued through the generations, passed down through James and Henry's lines. Every new generation heard the story of how it all began, about the rancher who found a collapsed woman by his well and fell in love, about how that simple act of kindness had created a legacy that continued long after they were gone. The well itself, though no longer used, was preserved as a family landmark. Patrick's great-great-grandchildren would stand beside it and hear the story of how their family began, how love had bloomed in the most unlikely circumstances. And on quiet evenings, when the wind swept across the Kansas prairie, people swore they could sometimes see 2 figures walking hand in hand across the land, forever together even in death as they'd been in life. Whether it was real or simply the romantic imagination of those who knew their story, it was a fitting end for Patrick and Grace O'Brien, whose love had changed everything and everyone they touched. Their story became part of the local folklore, told and retold through the years. The rancher and the woman he saved, who fell in love and built something beautiful together. It was a reminder that sometimes the worst circumstances can lead to the best outcomes, that kindness matters, and that true love, when you find it, is worth everything. The ranch prospered through changing times, through new technologies and shifting economies. But at its heart, it remained true to the values Patrick and Grace had instilled: hard work, family, kindness, and love. Their descendants carried those values forward, making their own marks on the world while honoring the foundation that had been laid. And so the story that began with a desperate woman and a kind rancher lived on, a testament to the power of love and the impact one moment can have on the course of many lives. Patrick and Grace had found each other against impossible odds, had built a life and family that continued long after they were gone, and had shown everyone who knew them what real love looked like. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, and worth passing down through the generations. Because in the end, that's what matters most: the love we share, the lives we touch, and the legacy we leave behind. Patrick and Grace O'Brien had done all 3 magnificently, and their love story would never be forgotten.